everyone, welcome to another episode of the Latina Success. This is our second episode of 2025, and it's a very special one for me at least because Kailey, you're my first official guest. So I'm really excited about that, and also because I met you last year and you coached me, and that was a great experience through the Catalyst coaching program. And so I'm just really excited to have you here. Can you tell our audience a little bit about you and your role and where you're based?
Yeah, for sure. And thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited as well. I'm Kailey. I'm the Vice President of Account Management and Customer Success at Loopio. So I've been with Loopio for coming up on 4 years. And I had kind of started my career in sales in a business development role, moved into an AE role, and then started managing sales teams, and then eventually moved over into account management and customer success. I think probably like a lot of listeners have experienced, those two functions go together quite a bit. So I've kind of gone back and forth between account management and CS. In my time at Loopio, I've led CS and account management teams. I spent about a year building out our digital customer success program and getting that launched, which was really exciting. And then coming into this year, have expanded my my role to include both account management and customer success. And on a personal note, I'm based in Toronto. So Loopio is a Toronto-based company. I also live and work in Toronto. And outside of work, I enjoy sports. I'm a huge American football fan. I do a lot of baking. I do a lot of reading. So try to fit in some other activities in addition to CS and account management.
Nice. Where do you get the time?
I'm not sure, to be honest.
I didn't know you were an American football fan. That's very interesting to know about you. Yeah, so exciting to have you here. Obviously, I don't think we'll ever have enough time to dig into your experience and the ton of like interesting learnings and insights that you have from moving back and forth in between CS and account management. And I think maybe we can start around the digital program, because that's right around the time when you started coaching me, and it was very interesting because at that time the digital programs weren't that much of a buzz. So you were kind of a pioneer in that area. I remember you experimenting a lot on that. So looking back at that digital program that you launched, what elements of it do you think were essential for its success?
Yeah, for sure. I think it was a really exciting project for me to dive into as well, because it's a little bit different from kind of traditional CS and sales, which is where I had spent most of my career to that point. So it was an interesting challenge for me to dive into as a leader, trying to lead and launch a program that wasn't necessarily something I had the most in-depth experience around. And so that actually leads me, I think, to one of the areas that I think was most important in launching that program, which was one, making sure that we had really clear alignment in the company and clearly dedicated resources to get that program up and running. So because it wasn't my area of expertise, and because, we needed to bring in folks who had kind of gone through that kind of launch before, we really needed agreement from the company that this was important, that this was going to help us achieve our goals. And I think bringing in a leader who is going to specifically own that program and drive it forward was really important, especially because I think part of the difficulty that arises in digital CS a lot is that it touches so many other areas of the business. It touches customer marketing. You have to work very closely with revenue operations. So there's a bunch of different teams that you have to work very cross-functionally with, and having a leader in place who can bring all of those different areas together, as well as actually build out the programs and start to design what those actual communications look like, I think was really, really important. We, I think, did the opposite of what a lot of companies do. When I hear other CS leaders talk about launching their digital programs, I think a lot of times people will start at the beginning of the customer journey and look to scale maybe the onboarding process first and kind of build out from there. And that's certainly not the wrong way to do it by any means. I think a lot of it depends on your product, the level of complexity, and where you're seeing the most time spent by your internal teams that you might want to reduce. But all that to say that we kind of took the opposite approach. And the piece that we really automated first was around our renewal journey. And so we had a really clearly built out process for renewals. And it was really easy to map that onto, what that would look like in terms of digital touch points along the way. So that's really where we started, and I think continues to be one of the strongest elements of the program, because when you think about what can go wrong in a renewal process, it's missing a key timeline, it's not including certain information with the specific wording that you want to from a legal perspective, and scaling that out and automating it really removes a lot of those risks. So I would say that continues to be one of the most successful parts of the program to date.
That's very interesting, because it sounds like starting backwards, right? And moving on to that renewal up until onboarding. So that's very interesting. Also, I will highlight that in our coaching sessions as well, one of the key takeaways was really the importance of having your leadership bought into these programs, because otherwise, because there's so much cross-team collaboration, if you don't have that buy-in right away, then it's going to be an uphill battle.
For sure. We spent a lot of time kind of marketing ourselves internally to make sure that everyone was on board and understood what the program was about. And the other element that I'll share, kind of going back to your original question, was when we thought about what we were trying to achieve in that first year and with the first iteration of our digital customer journey, we gave a really clear mandate that we were looking to take what we do via a CSM today and replicate that digitally. We're not looking to augment that program necessarily. And it's not to say you certainly can augment those programs with digital CS. And that very much came in the second iteration and going forward. But I think it's important to define that scope at the beginning, because otherwise it's going to feel like you are trying to solve every problem in the business with digital CS. And that becomes very overwhelming very quickly.
Right. I can imagine that. And also it's such a powerful takeaway as well that you have already mapped kind of that CS journey from CSMs, and you just take that and make it digital, and it's just broadening your breadth of impact within your clients. So I think that's really good for our listeners to just take in and see how they can toy around and experiment, I think, and take that liberty of not necessarily starting at the onboarding or not necessarily following or reinventing the wheel if you already have a set journey. On that, these are the elements that were successful. I think I'd like to dig into if there's anything that you, knowing what you know now, that you would approach differently about launching the digital program. And I will add a little bit more there, is thinking about it now through the lens of account management and the approach that you're taking now. So through that lens, what do you think would be done differently?
Yeah, for sure. There's a couple of things that I would highlight. So the first learning I would say is just that we could have moved a lot faster than we thought we would. Mm-hmm. I think there is always, and reasonably so, there's always a lot of hesitation when you think about if you're coming from a structure where you've historically taken a very high touch and personal approach with your customers, which is how most smaller companies build up their CS program. I think there is understandably a lot of concern with saying, well, now we're going to move to this other model and we don't want to do it too quickly and we want to set the right expectations and measure success. And for sure, you do want to do all of those things. But I think we were probably overly cautious in terms of the timelines that we were working towards. And along the way, we kind of had a couple company objectives that sort of shifted and forced us to move faster, frankly. And
as things happen.
Yeah. And as we worked through that, it was very clear that actually moving at that speed was fine. We still wanted to include those checks and balances and metrics, but we didn't have to be as cautious as we were being. I think on a related note, the other area that I would probably do a little bit differently or suggest that people are really considerate of when building out digital programs is having really structured elements of the journey available for customer feedback. I think, first of all, you want to make sure that the lines of communication are really open and that you're able to solicit feedback. Looking at metrics is great, understanding engagement rates with the assets that you're sending out, understanding support tickets, CSAT, retention rate, all those things are great. but nothing replaces hearing directly from your customers. So whether you're doing that in a scaled way via a survey, whether you're actually just doing some one-to-one reach outs from the CS team or from leadership to just gauge, do you understand how this program is working? Do you understand what has shifted in your service model? We've obviously designed it in a certain way that should still, we hope, feel proactive and personalized, but we want to validate that with our customers and understand if we're hitting the mark. And I think it kind of ties into I think there's often this feeling when you're launching a digital or scaled program that it's tech touch. So you want to do everything scaled and,
no one-on-one.
Yeah, there's this feeling that you shouldn't,
human.
if you're meeting one-on-one with a customer, that you failed in some way. And I think that's the wrong way to think about scaled CS. That you're always going to want those avenues for human interaction. They're going to be beneficial for your customers in some ways. They're going to be beneficial for you in some ways. And there's always going to be elements of the experience that you simply can't automate or digitize.
Right.
So I think having that kind of clear understanding at the beginning and saying, success of this program does not mean never speaking to the customer. In fact, I think that's a failure if that's how your digital programs are running.
Yeah, I agree totally. I think that the idea of that digital program is to have a truly hybrid model. So really identify those points where it doesn't make sense to have a digital touch point, but that we still have living and breathing feedback loop with our clients. And I will add something that also was a learning from our sessions, which was you encouraged me to always think about the client experience. So with many internal changes, I think that companies and smaller companies tend to shift things really quickly and not always are transparent with the client about these changes. And so thinking about the client experience of, look, this is what's happening now, this is your program, or this is what your program looks like, and how do you feel? I think that speaks to the value of staying true to your client and giving them that value and making sure that their experience is smooth and that not from one day to the other they're kind of caught off guard.
Yeah, I think the transparency is really key. This shouldn't feel like a change that you're trying to make under the cover of darkness with your customers. You want to be transparent around, yes, we are changing the way in which we serve you. What is not changing is that we want these interactions to be led with value. We want to be proactive. We want to customize the information that you're receiving so that it's relevant to you, and then validate that along the way. That's your intention. That's how you design a program. But you have to check in and see if that's actually working or where you need to make those adjustments.
Right. And if it's providing value, right? And to go back to your point about there's this misconception that the digital program has to be completely digital and scaled. There's no human touch. And I think this is parallel to the perception of AI and its role in both CS and account management. So we talked a little bit about this, and I want you to expand on it. Kind of, how did AI contribute to that early success of the program? And how did you communicate that it's not a replacement, but more of this supplement for the digital program?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think we were probably launching that program about a year before the AI boom really took off. But even with that said, I don't know if I think about what happened in the following year with the, OpenAI really launching and LLMs taking off, I don't know if that would have changed a lot about how we designed the program, because to be candid, I would say we've leveraged AI tools significantly within our CS organization for, internal tasks, for understanding analysis around customer behavior. But we have not leveraged it a lot in the actual delivery of our customer journey. And I think that speaks to the importance of those human interactions, right? And that's not to say that there's not opportunities to do that. I think certainly customer support is a huge area where, working or leveraging AI agents can be really helpful in scaling that process and doesn't degrade the experience.
Right.
But I don't think we're there yet from a CS perspective. I think it will be really interesting to see how that develops. But the idea of kind of replacing those one-to-one interactions with, interaction with an agent or a model or something like that, it feels like we still have a ways to go to get there.
Right. And just to emphasize on from the CS perspective, and lucky enough for us, you can give us both perspectives, right? So has the role of AI evolved on through the prism of account management, and how do you see that at Lupio?
I think for both CS and account management, it has evolved. I think it's pretty similar in terms of how it impacts both teams, but it's probably more visible on the CS team. And the reason I say that is because I think the biggest value driver for AI-led tools for CS teams, at least at Lupio, has been, some of those internal discussions, note-taking, administrative tasks where you're following up with customers, and in internal meetings as well. That is where I think we've seen the biggest, time savings and efficiencies. And the reason I say that impacts CSMs probably more heavily is because the CSM is always that role where,
right,
the AM is clearly leading the contract discussions. They're talking about growth, but everything else that's not clearly defined ends up falling to the CSM. And this is true in a number of different ways, right? But I think CSMs feel that administrative burden so much more because, at the end of the day, when you've had 8 customer meetings and you're trying to get back to everyone and clearly follow up on all the action items, that is a huge time suck. And it also takes you away from spending the time on things that you want to be doing, which is advocating for your customers, bringing strategic insights, really deep diving into their usage of the platform. So although those changes are not as visible, I think they are really, really impactful. And I would say that's probably where we've seen the most efficiency gains, leveraging, tools like Gainsight and Gong and some of their AI capabilities. Those have been really, really impactful for the team. And also as a leader, it's very easy, or much easier than it was to get, I understand there's an escalation with this customer. What has happened with them over the last 12 months? I can ask the CS team to write me a brief, which they're going to spend an hour on because they want to make sure it includes all the information. Or I can just go into Gainsight and, see the customer overview and the AI summary of what has happened, where the risks are, what's going well. And that takes no time at all.
Yeah, I definitely can relate as well with the just going into Gainsight, getting a quick summary of where the client is at, and that's so helpful for either business summaries or actually going into one-on-ones with your team. So it's also very validating to hear that kind of burden that CSMs take on their plate. Because I think this is very common across the board in companies. So I think that when you say it has helped a lot of the CS folks in the admin tasks, it's so powerful because then you get to dedicate time to reflect on the account, see opportunities for growth, and kind of have more strategic conversations than to have just that time where you're logging in meetings. So taking off that admin work. So again, it's very I think it's very insightful for us because you do have a view of both sides of the coin with CS and account management. And going back to that, obviously there's a stark contrast between both roles, but there's a lot of overlap too. And we talked about this previously, that it would be nice to hear just what principles from CS have you carried over to account management, and also vice versa, because you've been back and forth. And so how has that process looked like? What are the things that you carry from one team to the other that are really powerful for those teams?
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting. I went to an event a few months ago with a friend who works in a completely different industry, and I don't think she really understood what my job in account management was. And she said, I read your LinkedIn and I read this post that you made about moving from CS to account management, or account management to CS a few years ago. And I said, well, I've actually now made the transition back in the other direction. So everything you read is now irrelevant or reversed. But a lot of it does overlap, to your point. I think one of the biggest takeaways is the level of product knowledge that is needed across the organization. And I think that's actually something I highlighted at the time when I had moved from account management to customer success, was just the deep level of product knowledge that you need as a CSM is different than what you would need in account management or what you would need in sales. That being said, all of those roles, whether it's new business sales, whether it's account management or CS, everyone needs to understand the product and have a really deep knowledge of your customers and their workflows and the problems that you are trying to solve. For sure, it's important to set clear roles and responsibilities around, here's where we would expect a CSM to lean in versus an AM to make sure that people are spending time in the right areas. But I would say that understanding of the product and that understanding of customers is really impactful. And then also really just the selling motion around long-term value for customers. I think that's one of the problems that can arise when you have, sales driving expansion conversations and CS owning retention, and seeing those goals come into conflict sometimes because you may be selling to a customer but not have their long-term goals in mind, or if you don't have the right incentives in place, then there isn't really a driver to set the customer up for long-term success and make sure that you're selling things that they really need and that will add value to them and their usage of the platform. So that's not to say by any means, by the way, that you can't do that with a sales team or that all sales teams are structured that way. You can definitely, provide the right incentives and set up the roles and responsibilities in such a way that that conflict doesn't have to exist. But I think that has been helpful for us as well. And I'm sure we'll dive a little bit deeper into this, but when we split out our account management and customer success teams about a year ago, having account management sit still within customer experience, I think was something, it was a very intentional decision that we made. And I think has been really key to our success over the last year in making sure that those teams are working effectively together, because they are quite literally on the same team. They don't feel like their incentives are at odds with one another. Again, not to say that that's impossible to do with the sales team, but I think for us, that's been a huge benefit in keeping those groups under one umbrella.
And I will say that's quite innovative, I think, because traditionally there are separate teams that operate like mutually exclusive. Before we dive into that, I do want to add one tip, because you've mentioned how important it is for the product knowledge and for both teams to really be able to take a deep dive into a product, know it well, know common frictions. And for our listeners out there, a tip I can give is what we used to do at Slido as well when we were a smaller company is anyone who was onboarded, regardless of their role, had to spend 3 months in customer care. So they would take any tickets, they would attend any chats. And so this kind of encouraged that product knowledge so that when you go out to your role, you already hit the ground running. You have a solid understanding of us as a product and also our clients. So that's,
I think that's huge. I've heard of other organizations doing that as well during the onboarding process, and I think it's really effective. In one way or another, you have to find a way for everyone in the organization to develop empathy for your customers. There's no one in the org, even if you think about the teams that you feel might be the most removed from customer-facing roles, everyone needs to be aligned on the problem that you're solving from customers. We are actually prepping for our kind of company kickoff in a couple of weeks here in Toronto in person with everyone at Loopio. And one of the things that we wanted to do was actually have a group of customers share their experience directly with the company, open up time for Q&A, because it's so powerful for everyone. As you kind of alluded to earlier, CS and sales are on the front lines. They hear that feedback all the time, but that doesn't necessarily make its way all the way through the organization. So it's very key to make sure that you're focusing on that.
Definitely. I just reflecting as you speak, that's something that I really admire about your leadership style. It's very value driven. Everything has a really deep why behind, and always trying to foster, like, as you mentioned, that empathy. And reminds me of our conversations around the alignment in between sales or AMs and CSMs. We chatted a little bit about how important it is to have that healthy environment, but also a culture where people feel safe to challenge each other. And I remember you sharing one time about how important it is sometimes if you have a client that's not a good fit, then to be really vocal about it so that we kind of iron out those kinks and we set up for long-term success. So another great insight from our coaching sessions. And now I'm ready to ask you a question, which you mentioned about AMs sitting within CX. And so that I think is also kind of an innovative piece. So tell us about that culture relationship in between AMs and CSMs. How does it look like with them sitting on CX, and anything that you considered now after going through all of this process with the digital program?
Yeah, I think there's a few. There's a few different ways that I can answer, because I will say the AM and CSM collaboration, I think it does feel really strong, and I think one of the reasons for that, outside of just the structure, was we kind of had to strike this balance at the beginning of the year when we were splitting those teams out. We wanted to give the team clear direction of, this is what an AM owns, this is what a CSM owns, and not just high level, but let's break that down into some of the specific activities that each of you would be responsible for on a customer account. On the flip side of that, if you over-engineer every single part of the process, it's overwhelming for team members, and it's just not a reflection of reality. What we don't want to do is set the team up in such a way that, if the account manager's out that day and we need to get a customer in order form, we want people to feel like they have the liberty to jump in and support one another, but we don't want to be so unclear that people don't know what thing they're supposed to be doing at any given time. So I think outlining those roles and responsibilities at a really granular level was quite helpful for us. I'll come back to your question about the digital programs and kind of some of the selling that we did internally. I think in terms of the relationship with sales, I think the two things that I would highlight is, one, you want those decisions to be data-driven as much as possible, right? Everyone in CS has been in the position where, you're having a conversation with a customer in onboarding or post-onboarding, and the expectations feel very off from what we're able to deliver. But it's important to not generalize from those experiences. Expectations can be off for a number of reasons. And really what you want to bring back to your leaders or bring back to the sales team is, what trends are you seeing? So, if we're seeing a one-off situation that happened for, very unique reasons, that's not necessarily a huge concern. But if you're seeing a specific use case pop up all the time in onboarding that doesn't feel relevant to your customers, if you're seeing a certain customer profile, a customer in a certain industry or of a certain size is having unique challenges that it doesn't seem like we're able to solve, aggregating that data as much as possible and using that to drive the conversations, I think is really impactful. And it does start at the top, right? The example I think I've given to someone before is, when you're a CSM, as an example, you're responsible for your customers and your book. And so when you think about advocating internally, you're advocating for your customers, and it's not really your job to have to think about, okay, well, how does that impact an account executive, or how does that impact the onboarding team? As you continuously move up in leadership, it becomes more and more your responsibility to not just think about the impact on your team and their customers, but also the rest of the business. And so I think that's part of leadership's responsibility in driving those conversations with sales as well, is to say, yes, when we see these trends and issues, we're going to bring them to you and have a direct conversation around either what's going wrong or what opportunities do we have to make improvements or where do we need to make changes, but also recognize that sales needs to close new business. That is their job, and you don't want to put too many blockers in place to have that happen. So I think having leadership model that behavior as well and make sure they're taking an objective and data-driven approach is really important. Happy to touch on some of the kind of digital learnings as well, but I'll pause there for a second.
I think we can pause. Yeah, I think we can pause because it's all connected. But the action of just data-driven decisions, obviously, I think should be North Star for every company. But to highlight is how, or to dig a little bit deeper into this, how do you model this within your team? So for example, it's very common for a CSM, for example, to see their own accounts or their own book of business and have a certain perspective about a client business or their number of employees. And so how do you model that behavior for them to just take that step back and think about their whole customer base and take them out from that kind of subjective perspective of just looking at one edge case and specific issue, because it does take some soft skills, I think, to model that and to also communicate it. Do you have any tips on how you've navigated that?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things I would highlight. The first thing is I really see it being tied to, growth and development as well. And so if I have a CSM coming to me with, what they perceive to be an issue as an example that they want to highlight or escalate, but they don't really know what the scope of that problem is, and they don't know how to necessarily go about finding out the answers to those questions. Right. I think my role in that conversation is not, part of it is to hear their concerns and evaluate whether this is something that we do need to escalate internally and have discussions with other leaders. But part of my role is also to empower that person to be able to answer more and more of those questions on their own, not so that we stop having those conversations, but so that they feel like they have access to the knowledge that they need and the tools that they need to solve their problems, and also to help them grow into whatever their next role may be. They may be looking to transition into a senior CSM role. They may be looking to transition into leadership. And so I think helping them work through how you go about answering questions like that is not just, it doesn't help to just solve the problem at hand, but it also helps to actually support their growth and development. So that's kind of piece number one. The other thing I think is, when I think about my leadership style, I think part of the way I would describe it is that when I'm working with my team, as an example, in our one-on-one conversations or team conversations, I will spend more time pushing them and challenging them and, trying to help them to grow and coach them in these conversations. But when I think of my role, when I'm speaking to other leaders at the company or, having discussions with senior leadership, it's like the team can do no wrong. Like, I'm their biggest advocate and champion in those discussions, even as I'm pushing them in our one-on-one discussions. And I think being able to kind of switch gears and give that direct feedback while also making sure that you are advocating for people internally is really important. And you have to be transparent in that as well, because you also want to spend time recognizing people for their contributions. It's not like you should just be pushing people all the time by any means, but I do think about that split a lot, that my time with the team is really focused on, okay, right, if you're bringing to me this problem with sales as an example, what questions have you asked? What data have you validated? What workarounds have you tried to work through with the customer? But then if I have to have a discussion with the sales leader, I'm going to be really clear that, look, my team's doing a great job of navigating this, and I need your support to also work through this conversation.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, because I believe it's a very powerful reminder, if we have any leaders listening out there, that should be an ongoing conversation with your team. Is part of their growth and development is getting them to think about our whole client base, getting them to think about how does this affect other teams in the company, how does this affect our business as a whole, and kind of help them develop that peripheral vision if it's not there, for their own growth and development as a CSM, and definitely being their, I'd say, biggest fan and biggest advocate across the business. Very important to always recognize anything that you see that is worth a highlight, and also bringing that or shining a light on that for the rest of the business. So thank you for that reminder. I think it should go a long way with our leaders if they're listening. We can go back to the digital. How did you bring on board the account management team to the digital program? because, as you said, building a digital program messes or touches or overlaps with the whole business. And with sales, it's a topic that you work closely on. So how did you navigate that, and how do you see it now?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things in terms of how we brought account management into it, and then also how we message to the rest of the business. So I think, again, because of the order in which we did things, because we put so much focus on that renewals journey at the beginning, we've actually seen a lot of kind of commercial success with our digital program, which is, we see our retention rates being on par with the rest of that segment that would be in a more managed service model. And we've also seen really consistent and high growth within that digital segment. So I think actually, bringing in an account manager to focus specifically on that digital segment, I think was really easy. And despite having an incredibly high volume of accounts, I think they are really excited about the way that program works and the manual tasks it relieves them of doing, because then it means the conversations that they're having are the meat of the conversations. It's, where are their issues? Where do we need to have a discussion around your pricing and packaging? Where are the opportunities for growth? So I think that transition has been really smooth. And I do think a lot of it is because of the order that we did things in. When I think about messaging to the rest of the company, so it's really interesting to think about, it was probably about 2.5 years ago now when we launched that digital program initially. And in doing that, at the time, we didn't really have an automated program in place. It was kind of experimental. We were sort of finding our footing with what we were doing. And now, 2.5 years later, we're at a place where we've formalized actually customer success plans across the business. And so we're actually starting to monetize that customer success plan and also provide additional value for our customers in those plans. So the digital model kind of laid the groundwork to have that sort of baseline customer success package, and then add on additional kind of premium services from there. I think getting to a place where we were saying to the sales team, hey, you need to present these plans at in every discussion. You need to feel confident, speaking to the value of our premium customer success plan. We wouldn't have been able to get there, frankly, if we hadn't invested in digital first. And sorry, my dog is barking downstairs.
You should participate. It's fine.
But yeah, we wouldn't have been able to get to this place where we were offering that premium level of service, capturing additional revenue from doing that if we hadn't built out that digital program initially. And so getting the sales team on board from the very beginning, I think, was really, really important. In addition to the kind of cross-functional elements that we talked about, the account executives that are having conversations with your prospects, they are the people that have to feel really good about, the level of service that we're going to provide. Before you convince a customer you can do it, you have to convince your AEs that this is not, a worse level of service. This is not reactive. This is not because we don't want to speak to customers. So you really have to build that confidence internally. And I think, just dedicating as much time to that as possible and constantly reiterating it, right? Because I think you tell people once at the launch of the program, but you have to remind them 3 months in, here are the key metrics. Here's what is going well. By the way, here's what's included in the program or what we've changed about it. So the launch is very important, but there has to be kind of ongoing enablement around that as well.
From the technical perspective, or very granular, you're talking about bringing account management in right from the get-go. What does that look like? Were they involved directly in the process of creating the program and kind of giving you their input on, for example, you started with the renewal process, then what would be valuable? Or at what time did they come in directly to the program?
Yeah, the timing for us was interesting because we were kind of probably about 6 months or so into the launch of the program, or maybe a year before we even had an account management program. So because of the timing in which we just split out those teams, it was a bit different. But I think probably the better example I can share is around, as I mentioned, we have that standard CS plan, which is our digital program, and then we have a premium and an enterprise plan from there. And I think the launch of those kind of paid service plans is probably a better reference point, because the way that we went about it was working with the new business team on that first, before working with our account management team to introduce it to existing customers. And the reason for that is largely because, if you think about having a conversation with someone who has no idea what our pricing is or what it has been historically, is very different from someone who has, worked with the company for 5 or 10 years and, is very accustomed to their pricing model. So it's just two different types of conversations, and it's, just different challenges that arise in both. But it's been really interesting now that we've rolled that out with both our new business sales team and then our account management team a few months ago, to see the different challenges or the different areas of feedback that come up. I think we had an assumption, frankly, that it would be harder for our account management team to make that switch, because you're talking to customers who already have in mind a price point and, may have already interacted with these services in some way. And I think just the types of feedback that we've gotten from both of the teams is a bit different from what we expected. And there's a lot of learnings that we can bring from one team to the other. If you think about having that conversation with the prospect, if you think about having that conversation with an active customer, I think we made some assumptions about how different those conversations would be, and they are in a lot of ways, but there's also strategies that can carry over between the two.
Right. That I could pick your brain about the digital program and how it goes with AMs and CSMs all day long, but I'll leave our listeners with that, because I know we're kind of tight on time, and I do want to touch on the last point, which is retention. So customer retention and growth, both of them are North Star for account management and also CS. And so the Kailey with the sales hat now, like currently 2025, what do you think, or has anything shifted in the way you're taking on this leadership now, considering this whole time with CS, and how you approach retention and growth?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing to consider in making sure that those things aren't coming into conflict is making sure that one person owns both of those things. And again, we do that with account management, but I think you can definitely do that with CSMs. You can do it with salespeople. You can set it up in a few different ways. But I think where it becomes complex is where one person is owning the renewal and one person is driving the expansion and growth conversations, because then you are just at odds with what you are looking to achieve. So I think whichever model people are operating under, I think that is that's an important thing to keep in mind. I think when I think about kind of some of the strategies around retention, for us over the last year and going into 2025, I do think actually having, and this very much depends on the kind of stage of maturity that you're at with different companies as well, but I do think having those two people supporting on an account, the account manager and CSM, helps to, one, just dedicate the amount of time that you need to actually drive product adoption, which is often one of the biggest causes of churn. You really give the CSM the amount of focus that they need to be able to drive those conversations, and allows those people to play different roles in the discussions, right? You're not trying to have a conversation around pricing while also trying to fix a product issue that may have arisen in that conversation. And so it keeps those discussions really separate, I would say. One thing that's interesting that I've thought about a lot over the last year is, when we think about growth for our customers, of course, we have different growth expectations based on segment and, company size, et cetera. And I think, having a system in place to kind of tier the accounts in terms of expectations around growth has been helpful for our account management team to say, here's really where you should focus and where you should put more time and effort into those growth activities. But frankly, when it comes to retention, like, every customer is a tier 1 customer, right? Like, there's no customer that you're okay with losing or that you don't want to be successful. And so I think that mindset is important to keep in mind, and honestly even goes into, some of the discussions around our digital segment as an example. And back to what we were talking about earlier, the mindset should never be, well, this customer is, on a digital experience, so it's okay if the experience is worse, or we're okay with maybe not driving as much success there. That's not the mindset. Retention has always got to be priority number one. And frankly, even before retention, adoption and actual success for the customer has to be the first priority.
That's such a powerful exercise to go through, I think, for any company, both teams, CSMs and AMs, just to look at their book of business and assess where should they focus their time, where is the most potential. Because as you said, we want to retain every client, but not all of them are at the same stage for growth, and not all of them are at that precise point where they need a little bit more attention from either the AM or the CSM. So thanks for that reminder. I think that's a good thing to keep in mind for teams, and it's not a one-time thing. It's a constant assessment of those clients. And to kind of follow up on that, any data points or insights that have helped you tier or segment your clients right now that have helped, like, in the account management team at least?
Yeah, it's timely because we are kind of going through, as we start our fiscal year, just making sure that we're still looking at the right criteria and that we're thinking about things the right way. But I would say, the kind of criteria that we use today is really based on the size of the organization, the overall size of the contract, the industry that they are in, and also their overall license adoption. So those are kind of the key criteria that I would use. Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of kind of tiering our accounts for expansion and growth, the kind of key criteria I would think about, or that we've used to date, is really around what the size of the organization is, their industry, and how well that kind of aligns with our ideal customer profile, their overall spend and investment with the platform, and then license utilization as well. Obviously, that's a bit harder for kind of new customers coming in the door, so we leave that criteria out for kind of that first year. But those are kind of the key drivers that we use. One thing I will say, and it relates to a question I think you alluded to earlier, I think one area where we can do more, and that, if I could redo kind of the launch of our digital program, I think we would have spent a bit more time on, is just being really thoughtful about what the other triggers for growth are. So separate from actually tiering the accounts, just building in more programs that are related to supporting customers with their growth and identifying those kind of key triggers in the customer journey to help do that. I think that's one area that we probably didn't spend as much time on in the launch of our program, and certainly that we've been excited to iterate on. So hopefully that answers your question around the tiers. But yeah, I think in terms of kind of, what to leave with from this conversation, I think I would just share the advice that I've shared many times before, which is that the customer success community is so easy to interact with. It is such, it's a vibrant community, and one that's really supportive. As you mentioned, we had met through the Catalyst coaching program, and then we're able to meet in person at Pulse, even though, we live very far away from each other. And the whole CS community is really like that. And so for, people that are looking to solve a specific problem, get advice in their career growth, it is so easy to connect with other people in customer success who are going through the same challenges you are going through, and have solved them before, or that you can, work through together. So I just always encourage people to take advantage of that, because that's been such a benefit to me in my career as well, is how easy it is to take advantage of that CS network.
Beautiful. I think that closes it, because this podcast episode is a true testament to that statement of how powerful it is and how valuable the CS community can be for questions and support and mentoring, also receiving coaching. So just to thank you, Kailey, for your time and preparation for this. Thank you so much. I think you leave us with a lot of powerful insights. Hopefully we can do a part 2 of this sometime. But otherwise, thank you everyone for tuning in and listening to us today. You can find us in YouTube and Spotify at The Latina Success. So with that, I'll see you all soon.